I know a lot of you are interested in learning a foreign language. Well, Rocket Languages allows you to do it quickly at your own pace and while on the go. Get a free trial version with over 4 hours of free lessons and other free content when you go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/rocket. Again, that's wakeupcallpodcast.com/rocket. Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call Podcast. Today I'm speaking with Mr. Joe Lauria about this week's independence referendum in Iraqi Kurdistan. Mr. Lauria is a foreign affairs journalist and former UN correspondent for the Boston Globe and the Wall Street Journal. He is the author of the annotations and analysis in the book How I Lost by Hillary Clinton. You can follow his work via his Huffington Post and Consortium News archives. You can find him on Facebook under Joe Lauria and on Twitter at UNJoe. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Kurdistan-referendum. Joe, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Ed.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. So let's just start with a little background about the Kurds and what their political status has looked like over the years. So who are they, and what has their political status looked like? How much suffering have they experienced, and what have previous attempts at establishing Kurdish states looked like?
Yeah, well, they've suffered quite a lot, which is important to understand and why they had this vote on Monday. They're an ancient people. Their language is similar to Farsi in Iran, but they're a separate people. They've only twice in their history had a state. The first time was after the First World War. In the Treaty of Sevres, the British and the French, with the defeated Ottoman, agreed in that treaty that there would be a future Kurdish state in northern Iraq. There was a tribal leader in the east of Iraqi Kurdistan who then declared a Kurdish kingdom. The British government decided to bomb it to oblivion over 2 years. Aerial bombardment, some of the earliest in history, in 1920-23. And in 1923, in the Treaty of Lausanne, that promise of Kurdish independence was removed. And the Vilayet of Mosul, which included the Kurdish areas, was given to the Baghdad government, which was, of course, a British-installed king at the time. The next period we see was after the Second World War. In 1946, the Soviets had occupied northern Iran, which was the Kurdish area of the Iranians. And under Soviet occupation, an independent Mahabad Republic was declared. That was the second Kurdish state in history. In March of 46, the Soviets withdrew, and by the end of that year, and the next months of 1947, the Iranian government executed the leaders of this republic, and that was crushed. So we've had very short-lived Kurdish republics, but their aspirations for independence have never died. We move into 1991. Well, that's 1970s. In the 1970s, Israel, Iran under the Shah, and the United States under the Nixon administration supported Kurdish rebellion against Baghdad and armed them. And this lasted for 3 years until there was a surprise overnight agreement in Algiers between Saddam Hussein, who was the vice president at the time, and the Shah of Iran. They settled their differences, and one of the conditions was Iran would pull the plug on its support for the Kurds, the Iraqi Kurds. Israel followed suit, and then so did the United States. Henry Kissinger made a remark that may or may not have been accurate, but he made a rude remark about screw the Kurds, and the Kurdish people remember that. So that was another time that the Kurds were left hanging by the West and by Israel and Iran in that case. And if you move to 1991, the first Gulf War, George H.W. Bush, if you remember, after the United States entered Iraq in the south, he called for an uprising of the Shia in the south and the Kurds in the north, but the U.S. never offered any kind of military support for that. So Saddam began to slaughter the Shia in the south and the Kurds in the north. The Kurds fled to the Turkish border in the mountains, and Ankara closed the frontier, and they were stuck there. Many of your listeners might remember that. In response, the U.S. instituted a no-fly zone in the north and the south. And that is, under that no-fly zone, the Kurds in northern Iraq began to enjoy some kind of autonomy. Saddam could not go with impunity to try to crush their experiment in autonomy. This no-fly zone lasted until 2003. The U.S. invasion, which is celebrated only in Iraqi Kurdistan. And I have to say that the Iraqi Kurds do not display much sympathy for the suffering of their Arab Iraqi neighbors under the American invasion. But that really solidified this semi-autonomy, which they have enjoyed for the last 14 years. Now, ISIS, when ISIS came and threatened Erbil, they were about 8 minutes outside the city. The United States bombed. That's when the U.S. President Obama first announced this group, ISIS, and that the U.S. would go to war against it, and it stopped ISIS's advance on Erbil. However, as we know, ISIS took over Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, which belongs to the Baghdad government, but they also threatened Kirkuk, which is a disputed city and really the flashpoint in this current situation. The Iraqi army fled both Mosul and Kirkuk, and while the ISIS took Mosul, they did not get Kirkuk because the Peshmerga, which is the Kurdish military forces, they, long battle-hardened fighting group, they took control of Kirkuk. Now, Kirkuk, we have to understand, before the 1920s, was largely a Turkmen city. The Ottomans had moved a lot of Turkish speakers into that city. They were the majority, but in the 1920s, when oil was discovered outside Kirkuk, a lot of Kurdish and Arab workers moved there. We haven't had there hasn't been a census since 1957 in Kirkuk, so it's really not clear what the demographics are. But the Kurds have claimed this, the Arabs claim it, and so do the Turkmen as their city. And what we now have seen is this referendum on Monday. In January 2016, Masoud Barzani, the longtime leader of northern Iraqi Kurdistan, announced that the era of Sykes-Picot was over and he would hold his referendum. Actually, they held one in 2005, which never went anywhere. Nothing came of it, and there was a large majority of Kurds who wanted independence. So he announced another referendum. He postponed it until ISIS was defeated in Mosul. That happened a couple of months ago. That opened the way for Monday's referendum. Every country in the world, except one, strongly advised against this referendum. The one country was Israel. The United States was opposed. It said it would not back talks with Baghdad. U.S. and UN backed talks with Baghdad over these outstanding issues. What Barzani did was extend the referendum to the disputed areas, including Kirkuk. That really incensed Baghdad because the status of that city has not been determined. There should have been a referendum in Kirkuk in 2007 for the people there to decide if they wanted to belong to Baghdad or Erbil, and it never took place. So to extend the referendum there was quite a daring move on Barzani's part. And they voted for independence. The Iraqi government fired the governor of Kirkuk Governorate, who happens to be a Kurd, but he's refused to step down. So the threats that Turkey and Baghdad have leveled against the Kurdish regional government, the autonomous government, are coming to pass right now. There is going to be a flight ban on all international flights in and out of the two airports in Iraqi Kurdistan. That goes into effect today on Friday. There are Iraqi and Turkish military maneuvers going on about a kilometer north of the Iraqi Kurdistan border. The Baghdad government has said they are going to send their troops to Kirkuk to take control from the Peshmerga, and that's really where clashes could take place. I think a military intervention by Turkey and Iraq is unlikely, but this blockade, an economic blockade, will do enormous damage to the Kurdish economy in the north of Iraq. The economy is almost completely dependent on oil. President Erdogan of Turkey has threatened to shut down the pipeline. This oil being sold by the Kurds is illegal, according to Baghdad. It should be sold through the central government, the Iraqi government has been saying all along, but the Kurds have been selling it anyway at a discount to Turkey, which has completely fueled their economy. But in response to that, Baghdad has withheld 17% of the federal budget that should go to Kurdistan because of this illegal Iraqi Kurdish oil sales. If the borders are closed and the oil is shut off, the economy will collapse in short order in the Kurdish regions. Now, my view is this, that we have to understand the long history that I explained of the Kurdish aspirations for independence and the suffering and the betrayals that they have suffered. One, if you put yourself in the position of the Kurds, which is not easy to do if you're an outsider, but you can understand why they held this vote, why they want independence. But from a purely pragmatic point of view, it was a huge mistake because they knew what would happen, that no one would recognize this independence vote. And it's extremely important to point this out. Barzani has made clear over and over again that this vote on Monday was not to be followed by a declaration of independence. There has not been one. It was simply the expression of the will of the Kurdish people to be independent. So nothing legally has changed about the status of the Kurds in the north of Iraq. Nothing. It's the same. And because of that, what Barzani wants is 1 to 2 years of negotiations with Baghdad leading to independence. But Baghdad has rejected that. They are not going to have talks leading to independence. So therefore, nothing will change. And this referendum, in the end, should have been ignored, in my view, by Baghdad and Ankara. They are overreacting because nothing will change from this. Their attitude, in my view, should have been let them have their referendum, but we're just not going to recognize it. Nobody has recognized it except Israel, which I could talk about in a little while if you'd like, about why Israel is interested in Kurdish independence. So this is an overreaction and a dangerous one by Turkey and Iraq, the Iraqi government. The vote was simply, an expression of their will to be independent. The Kurds are celebrating it as a great victory, but nothing has changed. They will not become a UN member state. They will not go to the Olympics. The IMF will not give them loans. The loans go through Baghdad. It's really a dangerous move that the Kurds made that will not bring them independence and could bring them enormous suffering.
Yeah, so two more issues related to the background of this referendum that I want to get to. You've discussed a little bit of what Kurdish autonomy in Iraqi Kurdistan has looked like since 1991, but can you get into that a little more? Just how much autonomy do they have? And then you referenced Sykes-Picot in your answer. So for those who don't know, can you explain what Sykes-Picot is?
Yeah, the Kurdish semi-autonomous government, its capital is in Erbil, and it has its own flag, its own army, the Peshmerga. It issues visas for visitors. If you go to Iraqi Kurdistan, you need a separate visa than if you want to go to the rest of Iraq. They've been selling oil, although illegally according to Baghdad. They have an agricultural sector, although they are not self-sufficient. They say they have 6 months worth of wheat stocks, but they import about 70% of their food from Turkey and 30% from Iran. I mean, they import a lot from Turkey. Billions of dollars are needed for the Kurdish economy, which is separate from the Baghdad economy. Turkish businesses would suffer a lot if, in fact, Erdogan shuts down the border, so there would be pressure on him about that. But for all intents and purposes, it is its own state. They have a separate language, separate flag. As I say, the only thing they use is Iraqi dinars and the U.S. dollar, which is absolutely one of their currencies. You can buy anything in U.S. dollars there, they use the Iraqi passport. They don't have their own passport. So aside from the the dinar and the passport, they're, for all intents and purposes, an independent country. They are controlling their own border crossings. They are controlling the borders, the entries into the two airports. Now, this has become a major issue, especially today, because Baghdad has demanded that they turn the borders, including the airports, over to the central government, and the Kurds have refused. So there's going to be a showdown today. It looks like all the airlines that fly, international airlines, have agreed not to fly into and out of Erbil anymore, which is why I left on Wednesday. I anticipated that this would happen. So it is quite an independent state already, although it's not legally a state. To change this status into a state is an impossibility politically right now. Even if legally they have a case under the Montevideo Convention of 1933, laid out the requirements for a state, and they meet all of them. They have a territory, they're an ethnic group, they have a government, and they can enter into relations with other governments. They have consulates of various countries. I think 16 countries have consulates in Erbil. That's another thing that Baghdad has demanded that they close. Now, as far as Sykes-Picot go, this was a secret agreement in 1916 between the British and the French about how they would carve up the Middle East after they defeated the Axis powers in the First World War. This was published then by the Bolsheviks right after the revolution in a Soviet paper, I think it was Vestia, in 1917. So the Arabs in particular and the Kurds realized they got screwed because they had been promised, as those who know the story of Lawrence of Arabia, the Arabs were promised independent state in exchange for fighting with the British against the Ottomans. So secretly, while the war was still going on, Britain and France had agreed that they would not fulfill that promise, that they would double-cross the Arabs. And when the World War ended, there were these treaties, as I mentioned, Sèvres and then Lausanne, which carved up Iraq into a separate state and Syria as a separate state and not an Arab state whatsoever. And the borders that we have now in the Middle East are based on this Sykes-Picot agreement and treaties afterward. So when Barzani said that era was over, he meant that the current borders, at least as far as Iraqi Kurdistan was concerned, were no longer valid, and that the Kurds should become an independent state.
All right, and of course there are Kurds elsewhere in that region, in Turkey, in Syria, in Iran, and elsewhere throughout that part of the world. So what have we seen as far as relations between the Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan and other Kurds throughout the region? And what were the thoughts on the referendum from Kurds in other countries in that part of the world?
Yeah, well, this is probably the main reason why Turkey and Iran were so opposed to this referendum, and Syria was also opposed because they were afraid that they would stir up their rest of populations. But we'll look at the Kurds in Turkey right now. The largest majority of Kurds in the world live inside Turkey. They have been fighting a war for 30 years against the Turkish government for independence. So this referendum, while it caused maybe some happiness amongst Turkish Kurds, really it doesn't change the dynamics too much because the war continues. There have been lulls. There was a deal a few years ago with Erdogan, but he started the war up again last year against the Kurds in Turkey. Now, the Kurds in Syria are allied with the Kurds in Turkey. The same political party in Turkey and Syria rule, for the most part, the Kurds of both regions, not in Kurdistan of Iraq. The PKK, which is the separatist group in Turkey and has their branch in Syria, does not operate with the blessing of the Kurdish regional government. They do exist in northern Iraq, and the Barzani and the Kurdish government allows Turkey to routinely bomb inside Iraqi territory these PKK enclaves. So the Syrian Iran, the Iranian Kurds, it was just revealed today that there have been several arrests made of Iranian Kurdish leaders because they celebrated on Tuesday the result of the referendum on Monday in Iraq, in Iraqi Kurdistan. So there was a huge celebration. They flew the flag, which is illegal in Iran, and they sang the Kurdish national anthem. So they were clearly happy about this vote as well, and the Iranians are cracking down on that, as you knew that they would. In Syria, these Kurdish rebels there have been fighting together with the Syrian government and allied with Russia and Iran to defeat ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So because of that, because the Syrian government needed the help of the Kurds, which are backed by the U.S., to fight ISIS, they have allowed them even more autonomy than they ever had before. And the Kurds in Syria are using this opportunity to say that they would like in the future to have the kind of autonomy that the Iraqi Kurds have, which is something the Syrian government in Damascus does not agree with. But they're tolerating these calls right now because they need them to help defeat ISIS. Once that war is over, if it's ever over and ISIS is defeated, that will be a reckoning then between Damascus and the Syrian Kurds, who, by the way, last weekend had their own first elections to their local councils or communes. And they intend in January to hold an election to create their first parliament. So they're taking steps in Syria to create an autonomous government, the kind that exists in Iraq. And whether Damascus, what they'll do about this after the war's over, remains to be seen. Now, there are relations between the Syrian Kurds and the Iraqi Kurds and Iranian Kurds, but they are not coordinating their actions in terms of creating a super Kurdish state. That is really a distant dream, even more of a dream than an Iraqi Kurdish state, independent state.
Okay, and moving back to the to what relations look like right now, what the situation looks like between the Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan and the central government in Baghdad. You mentioned earlier that the status of Kirkuk has been a major source of tensions and disputes over the years. But what have been some of the other sources of disputes between Baghdad and the Kurdish government in Iraqi Kurdistan and Erbil?
Well, there are other disputed areas, and some of them were Arab regions that when during the American invasion, when Arab families left, Kurds have taken over these towns. They've raised, according to Amnesty International, they've also raised houses. So the Kurds are not completely innocent. They're taking land that Arabs believe belonged to them. But the main sticking point is Kirkuk and oil. Those are the two issues: oil being sold illegally and the revenue that Iraq is withholding from the Kurdish region. They have many differences over the constitution. The Supreme Court in Baghdad said that this referendum was unconstitutional, whereas the Kurdish regional government says that Iraq has already violated 55 points of the constitution. It's quite a complex argument there, but both of them claim that the constitution is on their side, the Iraqi constitution. So those are the differences: how to interpret the constitution, oil sales, and the disputed areas, particularly Kirkuk, which is, again, could become really the site of violence here, if any takes place.
For all of you out there who are interested in learning a foreign language, check out Rocket Languages at wakeupcallpodcast.com/rocket. Rocket Languages makes it easier for you to learn a foreign language at your own pace and in a quick and efficient manner. Their courses allow you to learn on the go and make sure that you retain what you're learning. They'll explain everything from grammar and mechanics to culture to how to incorporate what you're learning into everyday conversations. And the courses for all 13 languages they offer include lifetime online access to teachers and native speakers every second of the day. To get your free trial and mini course, check out wakeupcallpodcast.com/rocket. Again, that's wakeupcallpodcast.com/rocket. All right. Now, earlier you mentioned that the Israeli government is the only one around the world to be supportive of this referendum. So can you explain a little more of why that's their position and what their position is, as well as what other countries' governments in the Middle East that don't have large Kurdish populations, such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, what they've had to say about this?
Yeah. Well, Israel, has had close relations with the Iraqi Kurds going back to the 1960s. And then, as I mentioned before, in the 1970s, they, with Iran and the U.S., armed the Kurds. In 2003, at the American invasion, we know from Cy Hirsch's good reporting in the New Yorker at the time that Israeli operatives were working in Iraqi Kurdistan and trying to help the Kurds against the Iraqi central government then in that situation. And Israel now is the only state that came out in favor publicly of this referendum and said they would recognize a Kurdish state. Even Prime Minister Netanyahu said so publicly, which led one Kurdish official to say that he preferred that they welcome Israel's help, but he preferred that they kept quiet about it. That doesn't really do them a lot of favors with their neighbors. Israel's interests, I believe, are twofold in an independent Kurdistan. Number one, they would break up an Arab state. This has been the defensive position of Israel for some years, that the states that they consider their enemies surrounding them should be weakened as much as possible and divided. So dividing Iraq, which before Saddam, which was a threat, certainly was a threat to Israel, even after the peace deal with Egypt and Jordan. So the American invasion certainly helped Israel quite a lot in getting rid of Saddam, weakening that government, although emboldening Iran. So breaking up Iraq is one motive, I believe, is Israel's. And the second would be having an embassy in Erbil would allow legally the Israelis to operate from Kurdish territory, in which they can enter easily into Iran, which the Kurdish areas of Iran, and perhaps to stir up the Kurdish in Iran as well, with an aim towards breaking up Iran. There has also been American and Israeli penetration of Baluchistan in the south. So those would be the two pieces to break away from Iran, which is right now the great enemy of Israel, the way they see it. Iraq has been weakened already, but they'd like to further weaken it. And they would certainly love, I think, to break up Iran as well. So this is why Israel has openly said that they support Kurdish independence. It's for their own interests there. Now, you mentioned the Saudis and the Emiratis, and that's interesting because I've heard from a source who is close to Barzani. He was actually sitting with Barzani in his box during a rally at a football stadium last week in Erbil. I was outside of the stadium, but I saw him sitting there on TV. So this source has said that privately the Saudis and the Emiratis have also support this referendum. Now, that's possible because they have similar interests as Israel does vis-a-vis Iran. So to weaken Iran and to weaken Iraq as well, which is run by a Shia government, of course, in Baghdad, no friend of the Saudis and Emiratis. They have the same motives as Israel, so it doesn't surprise me if indeed privately Saudis and Emiratis, the UAE, are supportive of this, but the United States was strongly against this referendum. I think that the Saudis and Emiratis did not want to come out publicly because of that, and maybe for other reasons. It would not be wise for them to say publicly. But and I don't know for sure whether that's the case. The Saudis and the Emiratis are supporting this referendum, but it's not hard to believe. Now, the Arab League sent a delegation about a week before the referendum, strongly urging them not to hold the referendum. So they were in solidarity with Iraq and the Iraqi government to not hold a referendum. And Britain and France, the French in particular, have been strongly against this. President Macron called President Barzani to urge him not to hold this referendum. And Macron is actually supporting the Iraqi and Turkish response to this, which is, in my view, as I said at the beginning, way too harsh and overreacting. This referendum will die of its own accord because it is not binding legally on anyone. It is only an expression of will of the Kurdish people. It is not a declaration of independence. It is a mandate for Barzani to enter into negotiations with Baghdad leading to independence, which Baghdad is rejecting. So if there's not going to be any talks and only have one country in the world publicly supporting them, it will go nowhere. They will not become the state. And there's no reason to overreact, to cut off oil, to crush these people, to close down their flights and their borders. This is overreaction by nationalists in Iraq and in Turkey, and I think it can come to really a lot of harm. And nothing will be settled by this. So this referendum, although we can understand the Kurdish aspirations from their historical point of view, is not going to bring anything good, I believe, to Kurds in Iraq or to the Kurds in the surrounding countries, because they have their own governments to contend with. And this referendum means very little in terms of advancing the interests, in my view, of the Kurds around Iraq and inside Iraq itself.
Sure. Now, can you flesh out the U.S.'s position on this referendum a little bit more and why the U.S. has officially said that they're opposed to the referendum?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, the U.S. position, because it was only the State Department that issued some strong statements saying it was ill-advised and a huge mistake, and that they would foreclose any talks that they would support with Baghdad. So they played hardball with the Kurds. But as soon as this referendum took place, a couple of days later, the U.S. is back saying they'll support talks. So it was a hollow threat. Now, we've never heard from the Defense Department or the CIA, or we don't know what their positions are. And there are plenty of people in Erbil that I talked to who believe that the United States secretly was supporting this referendum. But could not and would not say it publicly because their public position has been to keep Iraq a unified state, which, by the way, has been the Secretary General of the UN's strong position as well, to keep Iraq keep Iraq's territorial integrity. So there's no evidence the U.S. is secretly backing this referendum, but that's believed by a lot of people there in Kurdistan. I think the U.S. have said that their strong friendship with the Kurds continues. I think they're going to try to get talks going, but to see what kind of talks. The Kurds want talks leading to independence. The Americans and others and the UN want talks to solve these outstanding issues, such as the oil and the disputed areas, and particularly Kirkuk. And even the Vice President Alawi of Iraq today published a letter on his website from Barzani, in which Barzani is welcoming an offer of talks from Alawi. Now, Alawi didn't say it himself, but I doubt that those talks would be independence talks. They would be talks that have been ongoing, on and off, about Kirkuk, the disputed areas, oil, and shared revenues. So the U.S. position, publicly anyway, is still they were against it, but they are now backing away from their threat of not supporting the talks to resolve the outstanding issues, but not independence negotiations.
Okay, and three other countries I want to ask you about quickly what they've had to say about this. What has Russia had to say, and what about China and Qatar? What have they said?
Russia is very interesting, their position. They were quite quiet about this. They took a very low-key position, although they said that they supported the territorial integrity of Iraq. In other words, they did not want to see this referendum. They also supported the aspirations of the Kurdish people. They're kind of playing both sides of this. Russia, in the last year, has become the largest investor in the Kurdish oil sector, billions of dollars. So they have a huge economic interest in the Kurdish region. Certainly, they don't want an economic embargo on the Kurds, but the Kurds of Syria and the Kurds of Iraq have had long relations with Russia. I think the Russians are taking the smartest low-key position, which is not to overreact to this, even though they publicly said that they thought the referendum was not a good idea. This is what I think the other governments should have responded in the same way, since this referendum will not lead to anything, because there won't be any negotiations over independence, and only one country in the world recognizes this referendum. So Russia's view is to calm things down, and that's what, by the way, the State Department is now calling for, which I don't often agree with the State Department, but I agree this time that people should calm down around here, in that region, and not do anything rash, militarily or economically, against the Kurds, because again, this referendum will go nowhere on its own accord. You asked about Russia and.
Oh yes, about Qatar and about China.
China has, China's view is always about, except in Sudan, which was interesting. They are always against any kind of separatism and the non-interference in other countries' affairs and keeping a state together. Because China has their own problem in the West with Muslim population. So they have a huge country that they don't want to see broken up. And so around the world, that's their position. In South Sudan, I was in Sudan with the UN Security Council just before that referendum. China had to use up huge oil and other operations in South Sudan. And they took a position where they didn't mind if South Sudan became independent because they had so many interests there, which went against their long-held position. But on Kurdistan, they haven't said a lot, but they have said they were against it. Qatar, frankly, I haven't heard them say anything about the Kurdish region. They may have, but I have not heard them say. They have their own issues dealing with now, which is a very similar situation that might happen to the Kurds. In fact, this is what I thought right away would be the reaction from Iraq and Turkey, to cut off the flights and to create an economic blockade, which is what the GCC has done against Qatar. As you know, a couple of months ago, in their dispute with the Qatar because of their closer relations with Iran and their support of the Muslim Brotherhood, and their Al Jazeera broadcasts, which criticized the other GCC governments and Egypt. So I haven't heard anything from Qatar. I don't know whether they would support an economic blockade of the Kurds because they are suffering one themselves. But they are part of the Arab League still, and therefore they, as a part of the Arab League, they were opposed to the Kurdish referendum, although I've not heard anything from them on specifically on the Kurdish referendum.
All right. And earlier you mentioned that you thought military intervention was unlikely to occur. So what, if any, impact do you think the referendum and its fallout will have on the ongoing Iraqi civil war and on the strength of ISIS in that region?
Yeah. Well, ISIS does still exist. There were pockets of it. The Peshmerga took part in the fight for Mosul. They fought in the eastern part, villages to the east of Mosul, but the Iraqi police and army were the ones that fought to take back Mosul, a horrible operation that killed up to 40,000 people, according to Kurdish intelligence that was shown to Patrick Coburn of The Independent. They have Mosul, they're trying to rebuild Mosul, but there are still fighting going on against ISIS. But the Peshmerga are not taking part in that, so therefore they saw this opportunity with the victory in Mosul to hold their referendum. Of course, if Iraqi forces are deployed to the disputed areas, as the parliament and the prime minister threatened to do, that would divert resources away from the fight against ISIS, which would not be a smart move necessarily. And this, by the way, was the European and the American position too on opposing this referendum. They felt it would distract from the continued fight to crush ISIS completely inside Iraq. So that would harm, I would think, the continued combat operations against ISIS if they had to divert troops to Kirkuk to try to take that city back from the Peshmerga, which would almost undoubtedly lead to clashes. Plus, Shia militia backed by Iran have threatened to go to Kirkuk if Kirkuk should become part of an independent Kurdistan. So violence in Kirkuk would help ISIS clearly. It would be a diversion. And that would not be a smart move. So from that point of view, the referendum was also a mistake, at least the timing of it.
All right. And do you have any other predictions on what the fallout from this referendum might look like?
No, I wish nothing would happen and they would just let this thing pass, because I don't believe it's leading to anything. But instead, we have nationalists in Turkey and in Baghdad who are, overreacting, beating their chests, saying they're going to crush the Kurds because of this. Again, I don't see an intervention from a joint Turkish-Iraqi military force. If there were one, Iraq doesn't have Saddam's army anymore. In the old days, Saddam just did it himself to crush the Kurds. They would need Turkey's forces, a NATO-trained force, to do that, but that would be extremely unlikely to happen. But I do think there's going to be an economic blockade for a short time, which will bring enormous suffering to the Kurds in order for them to renounce and cancel a referendum that's not going to lead to anything anyway. So this is what the Iraqis and the Turks want, to cancel this referendum, to have Barzani go humiliate himself publicly in front of his people and say, well, we didn't really mean it, and that referendum doesn't count, when it really doesn't count for anything anyway, in my view. But this is not the way the Baghdad and Ankara are looking at this. They see this as a huge threat. Just a vote of an expression of will, not a declaration of independence. So I'm fearful for the people in the Kurdish region, although they have brought this on themselves with this vote, that they will suffer enormously. It's a landlocked country that they won't be able to get out through land borders, through air. They can't fly domestically to Baghdad and from there make connections. So I think there could be a way out. I think governments will organize flights for their citizens, foreigners, to leave. But if the oil is shut off, that economy is completely dependent on oil. We saw what happened in 2014 when ISIS came, and then the collapse of oil prices. Government workers were not paid for months in the Iraqi Kurdish region. So without that oil revenue, and Erdogan says he will buy it only from the central government now. Without that oil revenue, there will be enormous suffering in the Kurdish region of northern Iraq, and that's what I'm afraid of. And again, totally unnecessarily, in my view.
All right. Well, let's hope that suffering does not happen, despite your prediction there. And thank you very much for joining me today. I mentioned in the introduction your book, How I Lost by Hillary Clinton. Can you take a minute or two to discuss that book?
Yes, this book came out a couple of months ago. We took the releases by WikiLeaks of the emails and her speeches. They're printed in the book, and I've annotated them and analyzed them with a long introduction and throughout the book putting into context that Hillary Clinton has explained by herself, hence the title, why she lost, which is essentially she was a hawk on foreign policy and an elitist economically, totally out of touch by her own admission with average Americans who she needed to vote for her. Julian Assange has written the foreword. It has been in many ways ignored by the mainstream. I've done a few interviews, and there have been a couple of reviews, but her book is out now. I'm reading it, and I'm about to review it. And of course, she's giving us the same kind of bromides that she gave during the campaign vis-a-vis average Americans and their suffering, the decline of the middle class in the United States. So I think my book tells more of the story, obviously, in her own words, with my annotation and my analysis, why she lost the election.
And she claims that her book is what happened. We could, I guess, say that your book is what actually happened then?
Yeah, what really happened. That's correct.
What really happened. All right. And I mentioned this earlier, but in case anyone's forgotten, what are the best places to follow your work? And then what are some resources you would recommend someone take a look at if they want to learn more about the topics we've been discussing today?
Yeah, the best resource would be Rudaw, RUDAW.net, which is the English language site of the Kurdish 24-hour news station, television station. They have a pretty good website. The journalism is not bad, and they are providing constant updates of what's going on in the Kurdish region and this entire issue that we discussed. That's really the best resource, I think, right now. I can be reached on Twitter, as you said, at UNJOE. I'm on Facebook. My articles appear on consortiumnews.com and on the Huffington Post as well. Okay,
great. Well, I just want to remind everybody that the show notes page for this episode is wakeupcallpodcast.com/Kurdistan-referendum. And that will be the place to go for all of the links and resources we mentioned over the course of this interview. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/Kurdistan-referendum is the show notes page for this episode. And I want to encourage everybody while they're on our website to sign up for our email list so they can get show updates and to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or Stitcher or your preferred podcatcher so that you can get all the episodes as they are released. And Joe, thank you once again for joining me today to take a look at this week's independence referendum in Iraqi Kurdistan and what it all means and what the implications might be. So thank you very much once again for joining me.
I appreciate the time you gave me to explain all of that.
Well, thank you.
All the best.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast. If you'd like to listen to more episodes, please check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also contact us via our website. And thanks again for listening.